general overview of the structures we're looking at this week. Please feel free to raise questions. So if you're during your studying of this, if you went over the lecture material and there was anything that was specifically troubling to you, you can raise those as I go over that. And then at the end, I'm going to go over some of the cadaver images that I've got and kind of point out some of the important structures that are visible. And then we'll see how much time we have left to answer questions and apply some of that, all right? Okay, so important this week, we talked about terms of motion or terms of movement here, flexion, extension, and this was really important in terms of the position of the upper extremity. I'm not going to go into too much of the details, but when we speak about flexion extension, it's really important to think about the compartments of the forearm that we're thinking about. So the anterior compartment we described as the flexor, and so all the muscles here are important in flexion, and some of the muscles will have the word flexor in the name. Okay, so that's going to be an important distinction. Where you see flexor in a name, automatically you should associate it with an anterior muscle. Where you see extension in the name, that's going to be the posterior side of the arm and forearm, and automatically you should associate it with an extensor on the back, right, a posterior muscle. Other terms that you may hear in some of the names, but also in motion, are abduction and adduction. Abduction bringing closer to the midline, adduction going away from the midline. All right. Then we think about supination and pronation. Again, these are involved in some of the terms, some of the names of our muscles. These terms are involved in some of the names of our muscles. And so we've got the supinators that help to supinate, so bring palms facing upward. Those are going to be on the anterior surface of the arm, the posterior surface of the arm, whereas the pronators that help to turn the palms down to the floor, those are going to be on the anterior surface of the arm. All right, so supination, palms up, pronation, palms down. Okay, so let's get into the actual structures here. So we're starting off with the joints, thinking about the joints at the shoulder to start. And we describe the different joints here. So it's important to think about the joints, what two bones are being articulated. Also important to identify the ligaments. Okay, so what ligaments are helping to reinforce that joint, that bone-to-bone articulation. And so also think about the names of these terms. Example, the acromioclavicular ligament goes from the acromion of the scapula to the clavicle, right? So think about the names, think about the two bony landmarks that are being adjoined, and that will also help you remember some of the names of the ligaments. Okay, so coracoclavicular going from the coracoid process to the clavicle, acromioclavicular going from the acromion to the clavicle, etc. Same thing here. We've got the coracoacromial ligament going from the coracoid process to the acromion, and then we've got the glenohumeral ligament, which is really encapsulating the entire shoulder joint. All right, getting into the muscles themselves, these are the muscles that are found on the back. So these are the extrinsic shoulder muscles. Although they are located on the back, they really help to move and reinforce the shoulder joint, okay? Really important, these two large ones, the trapezius and latissimus dorsi, are really superficial. So we're gonna have to peel back the layers of those two muscles to see some of the deeper muscles underneath, such as levator scapulae, rhomboids, etc. The intrinsic shoulder muscle are more intimately involved with the shoulder joint. So they actually cross the shoulder joint as well as function to move it and are located within or around it. So we've got the deltoid muscle, subscapularis muscle, and an important connection here is thinking about where these muscles are located, especially the subscapularis, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, because they are involving some of the fossas of the scapula that we spoke about before. So subscapularis is in the subscapular fossa, infraspinatus is in the infraspinous fossa, supraspinatus is in the supraspinous fossa, etc., etc. The chest muscles, there are only 3 that we talked about, but there are many more in the region. The pectoralis major, this large muscle covering over the pectoralis minor, smaller muscle here, actually coming from the coracoid process to the first couple of ribs here, and then serratus anterior being the anterior part of this muscle that's kind of inserting or digitating in between the ribs here. All right, moving down into the arm, we've got the biceps brachii, We've got the coracobrachialis. This muscle is being pierced by the musculocutaneous nerve. That's something that I'm going to continue to reference. So you want to add some kind of meaningful association to each of these structures. Okay, so how can I set this muscle apart? One may be its shape, one may be its origin insertion, one may be its function, one may be a fact like this, the fact that this nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, pierces this muscle as a part of it traveling en route to some of the structures that it innervates, okay? And then the third anterior arm muscle here is the brachialis. All right. Moving on to the posterior arm. So again, we're thinking about the back of the arm here. This is going to be the triceps. So this triceps actually has 3 heads, whereas the biceps that we just talked about on the previous slide has 2 heads. And so that's another thing, thinking about the tri versus bi and the association as a way to set some of these structures apart from the others. Okay, the elbow joint here has 3 important ligaments. We've got the radial collateral ligament on the lateral aspect, ulnar collateral ligament on the medial aspect, and then the annular ligament is the one that wraps around the head of the radius, okay? Moving down into the forearm itself. Now the muscles here get a lot smaller and are sometimes harder to distinguish from each other. So you need to think about them in groups, right? That's why it's so important to think about whether they're on the extensor side or the flexor side, because you can kind of group the extensors together and think about them in a group from lateral to medial. That's kind of one of the best ways to memorize anatomical structures, is grouping them together by like factors or attributes, and then thinking about ways that they're different as well. So in the posterior forearm, I'll point these muscles out on the cadaver itself so that you have a better understanding of differentiating them from each other. But again, what we see here is that they're all extensors, right? Another important factor about the muscles here is that if they're closer to the radial side, they'll have radialis in the name. If they're closer to the ulnar side, they'll have ulnaris in the name. They'll also have some other meaningful indicators. So digitorum means it's going to the digits. Digiti minimi means it's going to the small finger, the little finger, right? The pinky, and so on and so on. Carpi means that it's going to be crossing the wrist joint, right? Where the carpal bones are. So think about adding some meaning to the structures and also use the names to kind of guide you with that. Here are some of the deeper posterior muscles. So these ones are a little bit below in terms of that depth. So we're going to have to peel away that previous layer to see some of these. And again, I'll point the ones that are visible out on the cadavers. Moving on to the anterior forearm, most of the muscles here are flexors. So there's flexor in the name of these muscles, but we also have the pronator. So we've got pronator teres running across here. Pronator quadratus, we can see a little bit of that. And the pronators are going to help with pronation, right? We said pronation was palms down to the floor. And so because of the action of these muscles, they're going to be running more horizontally, sort of across the forearm here. And that is going to be another way to distinguish them from the longer muscles that are more tendinous and are going to be running across the carpal joint, okay? And again, I'll point these out on the cadaver where it will be more helpful. These are the deeper flexor muscles or anterior forearm muscles that we would have to peel away that more superficial layer to see some of these, but we can appreciate the flexor digitorum from a more superficial view, and I'll show you that on the cadaver. All right. The joints of the hand, pretty straightforward. We've got the metacarpophalangeal joint, also called the MCP here. This articulates the metacarpals with the first row of phalanges. We've got the proximal row of interphalangeal joints, and then we've got the distal row of interphalangeal joints. Now, there is no proximal interphalangeal joint in the thumb. There is only a distal joint. Because there is no intermediate phalange in the thumb, there is only the proximal and distal phalange, okay? And then of the hand, the only muscles we want you to know here are the hypothenar muscles, which are on the ulnar side of the palm, and the thenar muscle, which are on the radius or the thumb side of the palm. Although these muscles are individually named, we're just going to think about grouping them together as hypothenar versus thenar. All right. And then getting into the neurovascular structures here, again, I'm not going to spend much time talking about how to differentiate these structures. Please go over that video. I made a specific video talking about differentiating a nerve from an artery, from a vein. especially just by looking at it on an image or so on. But we're going to talk about some of the branches of the brachial plexus here. So the terminal branches that are on our list here are the musculocutaneous nerve. This is the nerve that I mentioned pierces the coracobrachialis muscle. So it's a really good way to think about grouping those two structures together. We've got the median nerve, which is the central nerve here going right down the middle of the arm and eventually forearm. And then we've got the ulnar nerve, which is closer to the ulnar side of the arm and forearm. Okay, so that's going to be the anterior nerves here. And then behind, sort of at the posterior aspect of the brachial plexus, we have two more nerves. So the axial, smaller branch, which is wrapping around the shoulder, and then the radial nerve, which is going down the back of the arm and forearm, and is going to innervate all of those muscles along the way. So triceps, all of our extensors, etc. Okay, here is a look at those nerves as they emerge down the arm and forearm, right? So we can see the median here, running down the center. On the medial aspect, we have the the ulnar on the medial aspect, the musculocutaneous on the lateral aspect, so coming off here. And then we've got the axillary wrapping around the shoulder, and running down the back end is going to be the radial. Here it goes. And then the last two set of structures are some of the vessels here, so the arteries and vein, or just the arteries rather. So we've got the subclavian artery, the axillary artery, and then the brachial artery, okay? Now we want to think about the division, and I talked about this in the video, but it's basically the same vessel that changes name as it goes down the arm. So it goes from the axilla and down the arm. So when it passes the clavicle, it goes from being the subclavian to the axillary. When it's running in the axillary region here, it's called the axillary. When it starts running alongside the arm, it becomes the brachial, right? So if I tag it just beneath the clavicle, it's the subclavian. If I tag it through the shoulder joint, through the armpit area here, it's the axillary. If I tag it running alongside the arm, it is the brachial. Same vessel, different name according to that division. And then the last two arteries that we're looking at here are the radial and ulnar. So the radial nerve is going to be on the radial side, which is the side with the thumb going all the way down. And the ulnar nerve will be on the side with the ulnar bone or the pinky finger, and that's going to be going all the way down as well. Now, these will also be accompanied with the radial artery, the radial nerve and ulnar nerve. So radial artery running along with radial nerve on the lateral aspect of the forearm. Ulnar artery running along with ulnar nerve will be on the medial aspect of the forearm, right? And it's not mentioned here, this may be an old slide, but the axillary vein is also in the region. I'll show you how that is differentiated on the cadavers here, okay? All right, so I'm going to take a brief pause here, see what questions we have, and then we will get into some of these cadaver images. Hang on here 1 minute. All right, so we're starting out with a back or a posterior view of the muscles here. So these are some of the extrinsic shoulder muscles. And what we're seeing here are the trapezius muscles retracted. So here are the retracted trapezius muscles. Remember that trapezius is the diamond-shaped muscle that's really superficial. And so in order to appreciate some of the deeper muscles here, we're going to have to retract those to see that those deeper layers. So for reference, this is the head up here. This is the neck region. And then we're getting into the back down here, okay? Some of the muscles that are important this week are the rhomboid. So the rhomboid major. Here they go, right? On the right here and on the left here, rhomboids major. These are the rhomboids minor. Here's major, here's minor. rhomboid minor on the right, rhomboid major, rhomboid minor on the right, rhomboid minor on the right, and rhomboid minor on the left, okay? Then we've got the levator scapulae, so the neck muscle in the region here. Here we go, so levator scapulae there, and levator scapulae on this side. These are the muscles that are going to help to elevate the scapula, really important in kind of shrugging your shoulders, and they're going to be seen toward the lateral aspect of the neck there, okay? If we're looking at this view, this is a lateral view. So again, for reference, we've got the head here. This is going to be the back. This is the shoulder joint that we're looking at here. And so this is that trapezius that I was talking about earlier. This large diamond-shaped muscle that's running from the neck all the way down, and it's attaching to all the vertebrae centrally there. And then we can also see the deltoid here in the region. So the deltoid is one of those shoulder muscles, more intrinsic shoulder muscle. It's going over the shoulder joint. It's going to give the contour, the rounded contour to the shoulder joint. And then we can see the medial aspect of the scapula here and some of the scapular muscles. So we can see the infraspinatus, which is this muscle here. Infraspinatus. We can also see teres major on the right here, and then teres minor also on the right here as well. And this is another one of those large superficial muscles. This is the latissimus dorsi, right? So latissimus dorsi, large sort of fan-shaped superficial back muscle. That one's really important for adduction, so bringing the shoulders in together. Think about hugging, think about rowing. So rowers use that muscle a lot. Large kind of flank muscle there. All right, this is a view of the chest and some of the chest muscles here. This is the pectoralis minor. Okay, we don't have a good view of pectoralis major because I'm actually retracting that here. So that's what's being retracted or reflected, but pec major is over top pec minor. We can kind of see the ridges or the edge of that pectoralis major here. And then the third chest muscle that we're interested in is going to be the serratus anterior. So this sort of jagged or serrated muscle here that's kind of going in between each of the ribs is called the serratus anterior. All right, so pec major, pec minor, if we reflect or retract that, and then serratus anterior. All right, going down into the arm, we're starting at the posterior forearm. So the head would be up here. This is the shoulder joint. This is the posterior view of our arm. And so this is the triceps muscle, right? All of this is the triceps. This is one of the other heads, and then we've got the deeper head. So there's a lateral head, a long head, and a medial head. And all of this, all of the back of the arm here is going to be formed by the triceps. Okay, we can also see some part of the deltoid here, the sort of triangular shaped muscle, which is going around the shoulder joint, and then a little bit of that teres minor. Okay, let's get into some of the vasculature that are visible here. So what we're seeing again is that pec major that's been retracted. We're also seeing some of the vasculature that I'll talk about here in a minute, but then more importantly, we've got the biceps brachii. So the biceps brachii this is the tendinous part of that muscle. This is the muscle belly going all the way down. And we can see that coming from the shoulder there, going all the way, running right over the anterior aspect of the arm. Now, deep to that muscle is the coracobrachialis, right? So this is the coracobrachialis, much smaller muscle, kind of starts up here from the coracoid process of the scapula, comes all the way down, inserts on the humerus, okay? This is the one that I mentioned that's being pierced by this nerve. We can kind of see the nerve in the distance here. And so the musculocutaneous nerve is piercing the coracobrachialis muscle. Other nerves that we can see and appreciate here are the median nerve, centrally located. We've got the ulnar nerve towards the medial aspect, and then we can also appreciate the axillary artery, right? Now, again, making that distinction that if I tag this artery up here, it's the subclavian artery, same artery. If I tag it in this region, which is the axilla, it is the axillary artery. And if I tag it as it runs along the humerus, it is the brachial artery. And just to point out, differentiating that from the vein. So here's the axillary vein, and we can really see some obvious differences between this structure and this structure. So veins have a thinner wall, and so we can really see right through the vein, and we can appreciate the dark discoloration of the contents of the vein. Veins also are more collapsible, so they tend to kind of just flatten down on themselves, whereas arteries are more patent or more turgid, and they usually appear more opaque, which we can appreciate here as well. The arteries are sometimes usually smaller. That's because they have a thicker wall and are more rounded. Veins end up having a wider lumen. So arteries have a thicker wall, veins have a wider lumen. And so veins may appear, because they kind of collapse and flatten out, to be larger, but arteries are actually thicker in terms of that internal wall. All right. Just reiterating some of the other muscles here. So here's a better view of that pec major. So pec major kind of sitting intact over top pec minor. And then we can also get a better appreciation of that deltoid muscle here. And then we can see that biceps brachii, muscle on the top here. And then underneath biceps brachii, we've actually got the brachialis, right? So brachialis down here. This would be the biceps brachii. And then we'll talk about the coracobrachialis, which goes down to the forearm in a bit. All right, so here is that coracobrachialis here, not coracobrachialis, excuse me, brachioradialis, just to clear that up. So this is the biceps brachii, brachialis, and then brachioradialis, okay? So here's a better view of that brachioradialis, which is running on the radial side. So this arm has been pronated, so the palms are down. And so what we're seeing is the brachioradialis running along the radial aspect. So the thumb would be here, right? Here's our thumb. And so this radial side is where we see that brachioradialis. Now, brachioradialis is really, it's really a posterior arm muscle, but it is usually classed with the anterior muscles because of its location, right? It's going to insert on the anterior aspect of the radius there. And so we want to think about it in that way. Some other muscles that we can see at this, from this posterior view are the extensor carpi radialis, longus and brevis, right? So really fancy long words, but again, think about the fact that they're extensors. So all extensors are on the back. So extensor radialis, because it's on the radial side. Extensor carpi radialis longus, because this is the long version of that muscle. So extensor carpi radialis longus. And then the shorter version of that muscle, so the word brevis means short, is going to be right underneath that structure. So this is going to be the extensor carpi radialis brevis, okay? Again, extensor being on the back, carpi going across the carpal joint, radialis being on the radial side, and then longus being the long version of this muscle. Other things we can see in the region here are abductor pollicis longus, so abductor pollicis longus. And abduction, again, we said, is bringing closer to the midline. Pollicis references the thumb, right? So anytime you hear pollicis, that's about the thumb. And then longus, because this is also involved with a shorter version, which is actually in the hand itself. So abductor pollicis longus, which is going to abduct the thumb. And then we have extensor pollicis brevis, right? Again, this is another muscle associated with the longus version, which is slightly deeper. And so this one is the extensor pollicis brevis. This one is going to extend the thumb, and this is the shorter version of that muscle. Other things we can see in the region are extensor digitorum. So again, extensor digitorum, this one is going to several different digits. It's one combined tendon going to several different digits. So we got extensor digitorum. And then next to that, we can see extensor digiti minimi. So extensor digiti minimi going just to the little finger here, right? So just to the small finger or the pinky finger is extensor digiti minimi. And then on the ulnar side of our forearm, or the posterior aspect, is the extensor carpi ulnaris, which is the going across the carpal joint on the ulnar side, also an extensor, right? So just to reiterate these again one more time, we've got the brachioradialis here. We've got the extensor carpi radialis longus here, extensor carpi radialis brevis here, abductor pollicis longus here, extensor pollicis brevis here. We got the extensor digitorum here going to several digits. And then we've got the extensor digitae minimi going just to the pinky finger. And then we've got the extensor carpi ulnaris on the ulnar side. All right. Same set of muscles here, so I'm not going to go through them individually, but just a different view. This time we're looking at the brachioradialis here. We've got the extensor carpi radialis here, the longest. The brevis is going to be hidden deeper. And then we've got those thumb muscles that I pointed out, the abductor pollicis here, extensor pollicis there, and then the other muscles, which are a little bit more hidden. Okay, moving on to the forearm. So another region where we have really small compartment, really small muscles. And so we really want to be able to differentiate some of these muscles from each other. So again, think about grouping them together and going from medial to lateral or lateral to medial, however you feel comfortable. So the first muscle we encounter is going to be the flexor carpi ulnaris. So remember, we're on the front side or the anterior aspect of the forearm. And so the muscles here are flexors, right? So we've got flexor carpi ulnaris, again, flexor, carpal joint where this tendon is going to cross, ulnaris because it is on the ulnar or pinky side. Then we've got the palmaris longus. And palmaris longus, I talked more about this in the lecture video, but it's one of those very slim or skinny muscles. It's mostly tendon and it's sometimes absent in a percent of the population. It's really not associated with a very strong function in terms of the flexion of the forearm. And so that's just kind of one way to think about it or to separate it from the others. Then we've got the flexor carpi radialis, so flexor carpi radialis on the radial side. And then we've also got the flexor digitorum superficialis, and then the flexor digitorum profundus, okay? So these are deeper muscles, but we can somewhat see through these more superficial muscles and appreciate these muscles as well. So again, we've got flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor carpi radialis on the radial side here. We've got palmaris longus going right down the middle. And then slightly deeper to these, we've got flexor digitorum superficialis and flexor digitorum profundus, right? Profundus being even more deep to superficialis. I also want to point out in the region that we've got the ulnar artery here. So here's the ulnar artery kind of running down from the, hang on, oh no, here's the ulnar artery, I apologize. So this more tortuous vessel that we can see here is the ulnar artery, and this is actually the ulnar nerve, okay? Again, you really want to think about looking at the vessel and looking at its characteristics. So arteries will typically do this. We can kind of see this winding or this bending, and that will tell us that it's an artery. We can also somewhat appreciate that there's a lumen to this structure. Nerves will not have a lumen. They're going to be cord-like structures, flat. They're also going to be more yellow or sort of off-colored, whereas arteries will appear either opaque if it's a big artery or slightly darker or discolored if it's a much smaller artery. Okay. Just to reiterate some of these brachial plexus structures here. So we've got the median nerve going down the center here. We've got the musculocutaneous nerve here, which is piercing that coracobrachialis muscle. So here's that coracobrachialis. We've got the ulnar nerve going down the medial aspect here, okay? And so you want to kind of find this M-like configuration. I usually encourage students to find this M-like configuration, and that'll be a good starting place as far as identifying the branches. So after you find the M, the central part of the M is the median. So here's our median. The medial part of the M is the ulnar. All right, and the lateral part of the M is the musculocutaneous. Okay, and then if you think about the deeper nerves of the brachial plexus, we've got the axillary. So here's the axillary, this little small branch that's being pointed out here. And then we've got the radial, which is going down the back of the forearm, of the arm and forearm. So here's that radial. All right, so median, ulnar, musculocutaneous, axillary going right around the shoulder, and then radial going down the back of the forearm and arm. We also appreciate the axillary vein here in the distance, and then the axillary artery here as well. Okay, just another view of those same structures. Here I'm actually pulling out the axillary artery so you can see it kind of emerging from those brachial plexus structures. Here's that M-like configuration that I kind of mentioned before, all right, with those branches coming down. And then we can't really see the posterior cord structures as easily here. Here is where that radial nerve emerges on the back end, right? So we can see that going right down. Here's where the triceps is. Here is the elbow joint, and here's the posterior aspect of the forearm. All right, lastly, we'll talk about some of the ligaments and joints using some of the models here. So we've got the elbow joint, which is visible here. And the first thing you want to do is identify medial from lateral when you're looking at the elbow joint. So right away, I can tell that this is the ulna, this is the radius, right? So here is the ulnar collateral ligament, here is the radial collateral ligament, and then this is going to be the annular ligament, sort of wrapping around the head of the radius, right? So the first thing you're going to want to do is find the laterality. So which bones are you looking at? So which one is the radius, which one is the ulna, and that will be a good guiding or guidance in terms of finding those or naming those ligaments rather, right? Here are some of the structures that we talked about in last week's unit. So the trochlea, the capitulum, the radial fossa here, the coronoid fossa there, et cetera, et cetera. So there's going to be the medial aspect of the forearm. It's going to be the lateral aspect of the forearm, all right? And so right away, we know that this is on the left side. Okay. Looking at the scapula and some of the shoulder joint and shoulder ligaments. So we've got the glenohumeral ligament here. We've also got the acromioclavicular ligament on top here. Okay, here is the coracoacromial, right? So going from the coracoid process to the acromion, coracoacromial. Here is the coracoclavicular, going from the coracoid process to the clavicle, so coracoclavicular. And then we talked about the acromioclavicular going from the acromion to the clavicle, so acromioclavicular there, and then the large one that spans across the entire joint. Now this is all one ligament, just has several different parts. All of this is called the glenohumeral joint that is being joined at that, kind of reinforcing the head of the humerus and the glenoid cavity there. All right, and then lastly, sort of very straightforward here, we've got the metacarpophalangeal joints here. Oh, sorry, that's up here, excuse me. This is gonna be the carpal bones, these are the metacarpals, these are the phalanges, so proximal phalange,